Hello, Alex here, and in this video I want to share my review of the Zeiss Planar T-Star 110mm f2, an ultra-fast short-tele lens for the focal plane series Hasselblad bodies, which I love to call the bokeh monster. Let's get into it. Like the 50mm f2.8 that I spoke about before, this is part of the F series of lenses designed by Zeiss for the Hasselblad focal plane camera bodies that have an inbuilt focal plane shutter in the body themselves, so the lenses don't need to have their own synchro comp or leaf shutter within the lenses. In some cases this alleviates some optical constraints in the design, and in other cases that free extra space just enables more extreme designs that weren't possible while the leaf shutter was there. There are also the FE series lenses that have electronic contacts for the more advanced features of the 200 series bodies, but I think they're optically the same as the F series, so we don't need to worry about the differences. In most cases, the F series lenses have one or more of the following properties versus their C series counterparts: increased image quality, a closer minimum focusing distance, and a faster maximum aperture. And in this case, they went all in with the faster maximum aperture, as the closest equivalent that I'm aware of is the 100mm f3.5 in the C series. That's nearly 2 stops of an increase. The lens comes in at 86mm long and 82mm wide, extending by a further 2 cm at the minimum focusing distance, and even more if you add the hood. It weighs in at about 800 grams depending on the setup, so although not a super small lens, it's quite dense, and given the actual optical parameters, it's actually quite small for what it brings to the table. It uses the standard Hasselblad V-mount, which means it will fit any Hasselblad V-system body, including the 500 series bodies, which it won't work with because then your whole setup has no shutter whatsoever. There is that annoyance, but the benefit of this is that the 200 and 2000 series bodies are able to use all of the Hasselblad lenses, including the leaf shutter lenses, and I made a video about how you can use those together. And it offers just greater versatility for the latest, most modern Hasselblad bodies, and it makes more sense to do that than to introduce a proprietary mount for the focal plane bodies. This is a prime lens, so it doesn't zoom, and it has a fixed focal length of 110mm. In terms of 35mm field of view, it gives you about the same field of view as a 60mm lens if you measure using the diagonal field of view in that square image, or if you prefer to use the vertical field of view, it's more like a square crop of a 48mm lens. So you could take it as a long standard to short telephoto lens, but in practice I find that it feels and behaves more like a short tele because of that narrower aspect ratio. Relative to the field of view, it feels a bit tighter than it is, which makes sense compared to 35mm. The front of the lens has a B77 bayonet filter mount on the inside rather than a filter thread, so I've got a 77mm filter adapter on it, B77 to 77mm, and even with 3 filters stacked, there's no vignetting, and 77mm is a very normal standard size, so getting filters for this lens is not a problem. There's also an outer bayonet that you can use to attach the lens hood, and using this filter adapter and 77mm filters doesn't stop you using the lens hood. The optical assembly is just 7 elements in 5 groups, which is relatively simple, so the absence of the shutter basically turned the lens into just a giant tube that you can funnel light through to get that fast maximum aperture, and it doesn't use a floating element design, just a simple unit focus design. The minimum focusing distance of the lens is 80 centimeters, giving a maximum reproduction ratio of just about 1:5 and a maximum magnification of 0.19x, so this really isn't a macro lens. The focusing ring turns extremely smoothly, and it turns about 330 degrees from infinity down to the minimum focusing distance. The front element doesn't rotate when you do focus, and of course this is a manual focus only lens with no option for autofocus. The aperture range starts at an incredible f2. Again, remember this is a medium format lens covering 6x6. It's not the fastest 6x6 lens ever made, but it might be the fastest high volume production 6x6 lens ever made. f2 is ridiculous. And the aperture stops down from f2 to f16 in half stop increments. The aperture iris itself is made of 5 blades that are a pretty cool shape, like the 52.8, giving a nearly circular aperture at the wider settings, but a slightly rounded pentagon at narrower settings, so you don't really get sunstars with this lens, which may or may not be to your taste. The lens is multi-coated with the Zeiss T-Star coating as written beside that huge front element. These lenses follow the overall design language of the CF and CFI lenses, so it's made of high quality plastics with all the usual accoutrement you would expect from those lenses. You have your EV lock button that's off by default and engages with the shutter speed selection dial around the lens mount of the 200 and 2000 series bodies because there's no shutter speed selection dial on the lens itself. You have a depth of field scale printed on the lens rather than the analog computer of the C series lenses, an EV scale, and in this case there is an infrared focusing mark. When stopped down to just f4, the lens is extremely sharp everywhere from minimum focus distance out to infinity. Chromatic aberration and spherical aberration aren't issues in real world shooting, longitudinal or lateral. Vignetting is quite well controlled, even wide open it's not very severe, which makes sense given the overall size of the lens. And although I haven't tested for it specifically, focus shift seems well controlled and I haven't noticed any issues with it working at minimum focus distance, which is relatively impressive for a unit focus design without a floating lens group. It's an f2 lens for 6x6 medium format. That means your viewfinder is extremely bright and it helps with focusing both at nighttime when you would want to use a wider aperture like f2, or even during the daytime, even if you're not shooting at f2, or if you are, these focal plane bodies go up to 1/2000 of a second, so you could actually reasonably use f2 depending on the speed of your film. The rendering of out of focus areas with this lens is absolutely gorgeous. Foreground and background bokeh are generally absolutely incredible. I will show far more pictures than I normally do between this point and the next, just to drive home how nice this lens can look. At far distances, at close distances, it generally looks incredible. There is a bit of mechanical vignetting, but it's not very severe. It doesn't give you a swirly bokeh look. It's not distracting in any way, and that's exactly what you would want from this kind of a lens. I think the name BOKEH Monster is quite well earned. For a 110mm f2 lens that covers 6x6, this thing is quite small. Like, it isn't a tiny lens and it's not exactly a featherweight at nearly a kilo. But compare it to the 100mm f3.5 with the C system. Okay, that lens has the size and weight of a shutter inside it. It's nearly 2 stops slower, and yeah, it's bigger than an 80mm f2.8, but for what it is, it's very compact. If you think about your 55 and 58mm f1.2 lenses for 35mm systems, this isn't that much bigger. There's something to be said for that. Lastly, as expected, the overall build quality is incredible with very tight tolerances, very good quality materials, and it just feels very, very nice in the hand, which is what you would expect from such a high quality and expensive lens. From like portrait distance to infinity, the lens does definitely show improvements when stopping down from f2. That's fair, it's a bit softer wide open, but at minimum focusing distance-ish, like a meter down to 0.8 meters, the lens really isn't that sharp. I've taken a lot of shots that I thought were maybe out of focus, or maybe the depth, there was motion blur, but I was shooting at very fast speeds, sometimes on a tripod, and the subjects weren't moving. No, it's not that sharp wide open. For portraits and the like, where you would probably be doing this kind of thing, it works very nicely if you can nail critical focus, which isn't always super easy. But for things like flowers and general still photography, the lack of sharpness is, in my opinion, a bit too much for such a high quality and expensive lens. That said, just stopping down to f2.8 or f4, you do see a huge boost in image quality, and at such close distances, you know your background is going to be blown out regardless, so you might be able to work around it. It's just kind of disappointing that it isn't as bitingly sharp, you know, at f2 at close distances as it is at narrower apertures further away. Logically that makes sense, but it still kind of rubs me the wrong way. Yeah, having to buy a bayonet to filter thread adapter is annoying if you want to use filters, but at least they're cheap because it's Hasselblad, everyone makes those adapters. 77mm filters are super common and relatively affordable now, and it doesn't stop you using the hood. Oh yeah, the hood. You're going to want to buy this lens with the lens hood, and you're probably going to want to keep it on the lens most of the time. When the sun is in the frame, or obviously if it's behind you, it's not a problem. Flare resistance is fantastic. That T-star coating does its job. But when you shoot with the sun, or at nighttime with another prominent light source just inside the frame or just outside the frame, the lens completely falls apart. You get these giant streaks of light across the frame from edge to edge, and it's not like a veiling flare or a rainbow flare or some nice colouredy blobs like some older lenses with single coating or no coating on the lenses. It's the ugly kind of flaring, and it's all over the photos, and when it happens, it will completely ruin your image. I find that it isn't always as obvious in the viewfinder as it is in the final image, whether that's because of the contrast of my non-acute matte focusing screen or stray light coming into the waist level finder versus using a prism. But regardless, flare resistance in that specific case is atrocious, and I would say the images are completely unusable when that happens. So again, buy the lens with the hood and be prepared to use it. The minimum focusing distance of 0.8 meters really isn't that close. It is notably closer than the 105mm f2.4 for the Pentax 6.7 system, which is one of this lens's broad competitors in the medium format world, prices aside. But, okay, 0.8 meters makes sense for a unit focus design without floating elements, and we've seen it doesn't perform that well at minimum focusing distance anyway, and you can't really work around it that easily with extension tubes because there are limits on what extension tubes you can and can't use with these lenses and these bodies. So your only option then would be a diopter filter or something like that. It's not a macro lens and it's not meant to be. I just wished it focused a bit closer. Fine, it's better than its peers in the medium format space, but for a 50 to 60-ish millimeter equivalent lens in 35mm terms, most of those lenses are like 0.5 to 0.6 meters, and that's more like what I would like to see. The aperture mechanism itself can only stop down so many stops, so starting at f2 means it caps out at f16 on the narrow end rather than f22 or f32 like some lenses, and that will limit your maximum depth of field and make this lens even worse for certain applications. This lens really is a stills and portraiture lens, and these are the kind of limitations that really narrow that use case down and make it harder to justify for certain people for other types of photography. I'm putting this last because it's extremely subjective and nitpicky, but I found that having just this and the 50 was not a really good pair, and it would have made more sense as a 3-lens kit with one of the 80mm lenses. When I bought this kit, I thought, having a 110 and an 80, they're quite close, it didn't make much sense. But in reality, having compared the TLR to this lens, it does make a bit more sense to have both of those lenses with the 80 as an EDC, and this kept more as a stills and portraiture lens. That's not going to be for everyone, that's just my subjective opinion, but it's just something I've kind of experienced with this lens. It does feel a bit too tight a lot of the time. Not always, but a lot of the time I do wish I had an 80. Lastly, I will mention again that this lens is only compatible with the F-series 200 and 2000 series bodies, not the 500 series bodies. There are rare listings you see where someone is selling like a 501cm with the F-series 80mm f2.8, and someone is going to buy that and not be able to take pictures just because those two things physically fit together. So there is the possibility of confusion, and it's not just a made-up thing. Like, I've seen listings, it has happened. It's just something people need to be mindful of, I suppose, when researching a Hasselblad kit. So this has been my review of the Zeiss Planar T-Star 110mm f2, the bokeh monster. The images this lens produces are absolutely gorgeous, and it's very compact and light relative to its optical characteristics. I do wish that it was sharper, wide open, at f2 at minimum focusing distance where it's weakest. And okay, it makes sense that it's weakest there, but bit of a letdown for my purposes. This is a weird lens where I feel like it's almost forcing you to use it for the intended purposes written in the manufacturing brochure, marketing blurb. Stills and portraits. It's not a kind of a lens you can use for macro photography because it's not going to perform well with extension tubes. It doesn't perform well at its relatively long minimum focusing distance, but again, it's okay for medium format cameras. And for landscape photography and other things where you need lots of depth of field, f16 just isn't going to cut it. For stills and portraits and as an everyday carry lens and street photography and a bit of wildlife stuff, yeah, this lens is stunning, and the images that you get out of it are beautiful, if not bitingly sharp all the time. That's kind of what this lens is probably going for. You know, f2 in this kind of format with such a focal length is pushing the limits quite a bit, even if it doesn't seem as extreme as something like the 52.8 Gigantor. You know, there's a lot to be said for what this lens does bring to the table, as long as you're aware of its limitations. And if you are looking for this lens, I hope the main takeaways for you are that you do need to stop down a bit when you're shooting at minimum focusing distance, and you need to make sure you get the lens hood. That's all I have to say for this video, so stay safe and bye-bye for now. If you don't already, follow me on Instagram at Shaka1277 for new pictures every day. If you liked this video and enjoy what I do on the channel, please consider subscribing or checking out my Patreon, where the tiers start at just €1 per month.